Ucraina, studio in Brasile, sta a Coimbra. È un gruppo internazionale. Stai bene, Lucy?
Dear ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to the 2022 International Open Seminar Semiotics. Although we are already in the 2023, we are very glad to welcome you here. Today we will have a very distinguished guest, Dr. Susan Petrilli, who will give us a lecture on Welby semiotics. Let me please say a few words in order to introduce Dr. Petrilli to our audience. Dr. Susan Petrilli is professor of philosophy and theory of languages at the University of Bari Aldo Moro in Italy, visiting research fellow at the University of Adelaide, and 7th Semiotic Fellow of the Semiotic Society of America. Her main research areas include philosophy of language, semiotics, and translation theory. With Augusto Ponzo, she has introduced semioethics as an orientation in semiotics. She is the author of many books, among them Science Studies and Semioethics, Victoria Welby, and the Science of Science, the Global World and its Manifold Faces, Challenges to Living Together, and many others. Throughout her work as an author, editor, and translator, Dr. Petrilli has contributed to the dissemination of works, among others, by Victoria Welby, Charles Sanders Peirce, Mikhail Bakhtin, Charles Morris, and Roland Barr, Julia Kristeva, and many other authors and semioticians, without whom we cannot imagine semiotics today. Her numerous essays are published both as book chapters and in journals, and they also touch many topics. And we are extremely grateful to Dr. Petrilli for accepting our invitation, for being here with us. I don't want to take more time, and we would better give a word to Dr. Petrilli herself. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Yulia, and the whole team, Robert, William, and everybody else, for creating this event, which I think is important. It's important to work together and share ideas and support each other and help each other. So thank you, and thank you for inviting me and for involving me in this wonderful initiative. I'd like to dedicate this meeting to our equivalents, students and researchers in Iran, which is not to forget the rest of the world. Let's say the local counts for the global, simply because what is happening there is the exemplification of what Victoria Welby and her Significs is all about. A big theme in Victoria Welby is commitment, engagement for the development of a critical consciousness, for understanding, for interrogation of dogma, of doxa. And it's rather extraordinary that we are witnessing the maximum example, I think, of the need exactly for that, for growing in that sense. So I've been informed. I asked how to approach the presentation, and I've been informed that, and as I know, not many people have heard about Victoria Welby. So I will give you, what I'm going to try to do is give you an overall idea a general view of who Victoria Welby is, after which I will mention a few key concepts and also illustrate how we can read Welby and go beyond with her theories. The whole point is that we can use her work today. So this is the sense, let's say, of the topic. Victoria Lady Welby, a signification of our times, a signification of our times. So she's a pioneer thinker, innovative and critical. She opened up new theoretical horizons and broke new ground in different fields of study, such as in the way of philosophical trends in linguistic philosophy, ethics, pragmatism, modern semiotics. The Significs movements in the Netherlands is a movement that derives from Lady Welby. I'll explain a bit more later. She introduced the concept of translation into the theory of sign and meaning. And her theory of meaning is based on interpretation, is a theory of interpretation. She introduces the concept, yes, I would say with meaning, she makes very clear that meaning is interpretation, translation. In this sense, she's a precursor of interpretation semiotics and global semiotics as well, as it develops across the 20th century. Her approach to identity and subjectivity theory and to what today we recognize as women's studies is also innovative. Manifest in original terms, for example, like her mother sense, father sense, metalemma in linguistics, ident in subjectivity studies, ephemeron, and much more. And I'll see if I can cover a few of these topics as we go along. She thematizes the capacity for questioning as a pathway to understanding, the humanization of experience and responsible action, researching at a time when evolutionary theory had unexpectedly overturned the conception of life and together of mankind's place in the order of the universe. Her Significs may be interpreted as indicating a pathway to what I call cultural revolution. We could say cultural evolution, which has nothing to do with violence, all to do with peace, cooperative, living together, thinking together, dialogic thinking together, as part of a long-term project for social change. So that's more or less what I'm trying to do. In terms of, I'll give you now some information in terms of context, intellectual and biographical context. So Victoria Welby is a Victorian figure. She's from the Ottocento, 19th century. She's a 19th century philosopher. She coined the term significs. This is what characterizes Victoria Welby, significs, which is the term that she introduced for her particular approach to theory of sign and meaning. Let's have a look here. So what does she say about meaning? In an essay of 1893 entitled Meaning and Metaphor. The human being is the one not merely who thinks or speaks or writes or looks upwards, but the one who means, the one who is the meaning of much. So the human being is our end and objective, humanity. So the human being makes the meaning of all, the one who will not tolerate the unmeaning, the insignificant, anywhere in experience. So Significs is intended to emphasize the ethical dimension of human meaning processes, the special focus on the interrelation between sense, signs, and values. Thus, Significs is also oriented towards the pragmatic dimension of signifying processes of expression and communication. So she's working on communication, signs, language, in particular verbal language, and considering what to call her theory of meaning. And she decides to call it Significs and not semantics. Semantics had been coined at the time by Michel Breal, who writes the book, publishes Essai de Semiotics in 1896. She chooses Significs also as against semiotic, which was Peirce's proposal, what the term Peirce introduced for his approach to theory of sign and meaning. So other terms circulating at the time, semotology, semasiology, etc., etc., semiology, semiology. Why? So why does she choose Significs, given that these terms were readily available? She didn't want to be conditioned by other trends. She was giving her approach as a special slant, wanted to think freely. She was very interested. The focus was on the relation between signs and values. She had also considered terms like sensifics, a neologism, and signics, which she rejected. Sensifics, because it was too closely associated with the world of the senses at the level of physical perception, and signics, because it failed to convey the relation between signs and values. She wished to explore the relation between signs and values freely, which implied exploring the relation among the sciences that elect such phenomena as their object of study, such as philosophy of language, semiotics, axiology, ethics. So Welby's research embraced problems associated with meaning, language, knowledge, terminology, communication, signifying behavior, interpretation, translation, interpersonal relations, subjectivity, all of which are transversal with respect to judgment and experience, based on the assumption that the relation between signs, meaning, and value is of central importance to every conceivable sphere of human interest and behavior, and thus focusing on the ethical, pragmatic, and even aesthetic dimensions of signifying processes. Welby Significs reaches beyond pure descriptivism or the strictly gnosiological boundaries of sign and language studies. Context, for example, is important for Welby. She underlines the importance of context for meaning. Meaning is not fixed and given once and for all. Meaning for Welby is an ongoing process in becoming, in the result of interpretation. So the critique of language is important. The critique of language for critical linguistic consciousness, for the sake of interpretation and understanding, rather than misinterpretation, misunderstanding, confusion, mystification. And when she elaborates her theory in dialogue with all the sciences, which is really extraordinary. She was very, very informed and updated on absolutely anything worth knowing about. So Significs is not conceived as a new independent science or theory, among others, but as an interdisciplinary method, I would say, in the face of a great multiplicity of different research areas and disciplines, a critical meta-language relevant to all human signifying systems, with a commitment to the axiological dimension of signification as the unifying factor. It unites the critique of language and knowledge to the critique of practice. The term Significs designates a transdisciplinary approach and not a supplanting system. This is her expression, so that its scope and reference is universal or intended to be. Most significantly, as Welby herself says, the principle involved forms a natural self-acting critique of every system in turn, including the common sense ideal. So, Welby then, there's a there are dictionary definitions available of Significs. One was published in 1911. It was not by her, but approved by her. Another is from 1903. Dictionary definition published in the Dictionary of Philosophy and Psychology in 3 volumes, edited by James Baldwin. She co-authored for that dictionary with George Stout and James Baldwin, 3 authors. They co-authored a dictionary definition of Significs, which I have here, but I won't read it to you now. If we have time, we can read it at the end of our paper. These are important moments of recognition, let's say, for her lifelong research. Her legacy, Welby's legacy. She published 2 Signific-related books. I'm getting an echo. Oh. Is everything okay? Can you hear me? Can I continue?
Yes, Dr. Petrilli, we can hear you, but it is present, the echo.
There's an echo, okay. It comes and goes. Yulia, make sure you don't disappear, that I can see you. Thank you. So, as far as her legacy goes, she published 2 important Significs-related books during her lifetime. What is Meaning is the main book. The subtitle is Studies on the Development of Significance, and that was published in 1903. And then the other book was published in 1911, Significs and Language. These 2 books were brought to our attention in the 1980s, thanks to Achim Eschbach and Walter Schmitz, 2 German scholars, who republished these books and made them available again in a book series directed by Achim Eschbach, Foundations of Semiotics with John Benjamin. So that is an absolutely fundamental point of departure for renewed interest in Victoria Welby and her Significs, for which we will always be grateful. 2 essays are important for from the point of view of Significs by Victoria Welby. Sense, Meaning and Metaphor, which I mentioned it before, which was published in 1893. Sense, Meaning and Interpretation, which was published in 1896. Apart from that, there are other essays of interest for anthropologists, for example. She published a lot of essaylets, which are writing. She published them privately, and texts of 1, 2, 3, 4 pages, things like that. Her legacy is mainly still in the archives, I would say, and is still mainly unpublished. She had books planned to publish, a handbook of Significs, another book on education. She attached enormous importance to education. And there are lots of materials in the archives which look ready, they'd been prepared for publication. We need young researchers in there looking at these papers and getting them out to the public and circulating. Together with papers, let's say scientific papers, lots and lots of correspondence, important correspondence, correspondence well worth reading. And again, hopefully we get people into the archives looking at that work and making that available too. Yes, What is Meaning was reviewed by Charles Sanders Peirce, and it was reviewed positively in 1903, the same year as her book was published. He actually associated Victoria Welby's book to a book by Bertrand Russell. Welby, Peirce, we know, is the founder of pragmatism. Welby may be considered, I believe, as holding her own in terms of the genealogy of ideas. I have described her as the founding mother of modern semiotics in a book called Semiotics Unbounded, where a large section is dedicated to Victoria Welby together with Charles Peirce. I believe she is, or may be considered, the founding mother of pragmatism as well, which she doubtlessly prefigures, as attested by her writings and largely by her correspondence and unpublished papers. She had important correspondence, important letter exchanges with well over 450 of the most prominent figures circulating at the time, amongst whom names like Charles Peirce, Ferdinand Schiller, who is the founder of English pragmatism, considered so. He was younger than Welby and has a very important correspondence with Welby, discussing ideas. Giovanni Vailati in Italy, and his colleague Mario Calderoni, and many others. Peirce's review of Welby's book begins their correspondence, which lasted for about 10 years. This epistolary with Peirce represents just one instance of a fascinating network of letter exchanges entertained by Welby with numerous major figures of the time, and currently and centrally important for the intellectual work developed together in dialogue and communicated to the international community. People at the time knew about Welby, there was no doubt about that, and her work. So other figures she was that she was communicating with included the logicians, philosophers, psychologists like George Stout, Max Müller, Benjamin Jowett. I've mentioned Bertrand Russell, Charles Ogden, Wells, the writer, George Bernard Shaw, many more, Bréal, Lalande, André Lalande, Poincaré, Henri Bergson, Ferdinand Tönnies. Tönnies, a German scholar, won the Welby Prize, which was publicized in 1896 on the journal called Mind. Who else? Yes, the Williams, Henry and James, the James brothers, Henry and William James, and many more. There were also women among her contacts, intellectuals, writers, novelists of the likes of Mary Everest Ball, Julia Wedgwood, Lynn Linton, Vernon Lee, the novelist, Lucy Clifford. But given that at the time, public life and the professions were heavily male-dominated, women were inevitably far fewer in Welby circles, less prominent, but certainly not less significant. And I've dedicated a chapter in particular on Welby and Mary Everest book, Mary Everest Bull, for a book dedicated to female friendships and published just very recently. Let's have a look. Yes, through her social and epistolary network, Welby made a major contribution to the circulation of ideas, mainly in the sphere of philosophy, relatedly to her interest in knowledge, language, and meaning, but also in diverse other disciplines. Inevitably, she had discussions, serious discussions in the fields, in such fields as anthropology, ethnology, psychology, education, sociology, theology. Not as a theologian, but she was not afraid of confrontation and discussion, even with theologists, biology, mathematics, physics, metaphysics, etc. She prefigured many other trends and disciplines in their interdisciplinary and multimodal developments as they have developed across the 20th century and into the 21st. We've mentioned translation studies, cultural studies, communication studies, subjectivity and identity studies. I'll also say she published her book, What is Meaning, in 1903. By 1920, the interest on meaning and the problem of meaning had grown in a very important way, to the point that there was a symposium organized. When was that? 1920-21 in Oxford. The results were published in the journal Mine. The title of the symposium and the publication is The Meaning of Meaning. So we had What is Meaning, Victoria Welby. The symposium, The Meaning of Meaning, with the participation of Charles Strong and Alfred Sidgwick, important philosophers of the time. Speakers included Schiller, Russell, and Harold Joachim. Charles Ogden published his book with Ivor Richard in 1923. I think that was called The Meaning of Meaning, The Meaning of Meaning. That's Charles Ogden. And that has been an important book for studies on meaning since then. Welby, in fact, hoped to have a follower in Ogden. She'd made all her work available to him. That didn't quite happen, but we won't go into that now. So Significs also emerged as a point of departure for later research by others on the social, psychological, aesthetic, and logical dimension of communication. Through the Dutch poet Frederik van Eeden, a poet, psychiatrist, and social reformer, he met Welby at a conference for psychologists in London at the end of the 19th century. And through their friendship, through Frederik van Eeden and their correspondence, the Significs movement in the Netherlands is spawned and develops, noteworthy for its interdisciplinariness and vocation for open discussion. The Signific movement in the Netherlands maintains contacts with representatives of the Vienna Circle and the Unity of Science movement. The Signific movement flourished across the first half of the 20th century and produced interesting results in terms of meetings, publications, and programs for social reform. I've published a book, Signifying and Understanding, which includes, in 209, which includes my studies on Welby and Significs, and also attempts to make as much material available as I could in the volume, published materials, but also unpublished materials from the archives, and also an anthology of writings by first-generation Significians. So that's just an attempt to make materials available as widely as possible, and for what I was able to do then. So Welby responded critically to prejudicial and stereotypical discourse of the times, the Victorian age, and to the tendency to submit unquestionably, she couldn't accept that, passive acceptance, to the strongholds of truth, morality, and justice, whether the church and its so-called ecclesiasts or secular power, then represented by Queen Victoria, her godmother. She served as the Queen's Court, at the Queen's Court as maid of honor for 2 years after her mother's death in the Syrian desert on the last of their numerous travels across unknown lands. Rather than a conventional education, Welby's books were the world and the inspiring life she had led in very unusual and even difficult circumstances. She soon determined that authority should be interrogated, that social practice should be significant for the sake of the community as much as for the single individual, that human behavior calls to be endowed at all moments with sense and purport, and that signifying, expressive and communicative practices call for interpretation, translation, critique, and responsibility. So that, let's say, is a presentation of Welby and where she's coming from in the context. Obviously, you know, there's so much more we could say, but time will not allow it. So a few central or key concepts in Welby's Significs. I think I've got 6 or 7 here, so we'll see what we can, as far as we can get, and we can stop whenever we want to. So her meaning triad of meaning is fundamental. She distinguishes between three levels: sense, so her theory of meaning, 3 levels: sense, meaning, and significance. So the term sense is ambivalent. It has a general meaning to indicate, let's say, the overall import of an expression, word, or utterance. It's signifying value. But sense is also the name of the first level in her meaning triad. What does it mean there? It denotes the most primitive level of pre-rational life, the initial stages of perception, of immediate response to the environment, and practical use of signs. Welby studied biology, and sense is also associated to the environment and to the organism. Experience is always endowed with sense, and sense is a value as much as our meaning and significance. As such, sense value is a necessary condition for general experience and for the persistence of life. Then the second level, meaning. Meaning too is ambivalent. We've already said theory of meaning, so obviously it's the general term, but it is also the name of the second level in her meaning triad. It counts both in the general sense and in the as well as denominating the second level. In that context, it concerns rational life, thus the intentional, volitional aspects of signification. Meaning is less immediate with respect to the first level in her triad. It involves conscious, interpretive processes, intentional, inferential meaning processes. And then we have significance. So significance involves meaning and interpretive work at varying degrees of what I would call, with an expression that is not Welby's, responsive understanding, which is connected to my research on Michael Bakhtin and work with Augusto Ponzio. Originally, Welby described her meaning triad with the terms sense, meaning, interpretation. Sense, meaning, interpretation. In fact, her 1896 essay is entitled Sense, Meaning, and Interpretation. But then Welby very, very quickly understands that interpretation is always involved when we are what she calls significating. Interpretation, and this is why I say she really is extraordinary, a real forerunner of interpretation semiotics. If we have time, I'll talk more about that. Interpretation semiotics as it develops across the 20th century. Significance concerns meaning, import, and ultimate value, overall bearing of an experience, an event, an expression, a relation, whether verbal as in the case of a text, an utterance, or non-verbal. Significance is the consequence and implication of any given communicative act. It tells of its relevance for each one of us, whether scientist, philosopher, or layperson. Significance is expression value in terms of signifying implication, the condition of being significant, meaningful, which inevitably involves interpretive, participative involvement. This last aspect or dimension of signifying processes inevitably leads to the question of responsibility, which is something I insist on. I have a passage from What is Meaning, which I won't read, but which we can read if we have time and if you want. There are other triads in Welby's thinking. She correlates her triad to other triads. For example, just to give you an example, for knowledge and experience, she distinguishes between consciousness, intellect, reason. About consciousness, she distinguishes between planetary, solar, cosmic. Charles Peirce also establishes a correlation between Welby's sense, meaning, significance, and his analysis of the interpretant, the immediate interpretant, the dynamical interpretant, and the final interpretant. They don't converge, they don't overlap, absolutely. There are associations, and probably the association significs and final interpretant is the closest. So, point two, another key concept, as we have already mentioned, is her critique of language and the concept of interpretation. I've already repeated her insistence on the critique of language, her critical for the development of critical linguistic consciousness, which is why she's interested in education, educating the young from the very beginning to question, to interrogate. Her interest, in fact, begins reading the sacred, her interest in language and meaning begins with reading the sacred scriptures, which is interesting. She was an Anglican and she was religious. She was a believer, and was very interested in reading the Bible, which she did, and she claimed in dialogue with the theologians, with the ecclesiasts, representatives of doxa, of dogma. She was claiming that that language was outmoded with respect to the message that was wanting to be conveyed. She considered, she actually published a book of comments on the sacred scriptures. The book is entitled Links and Clues, and it's her interpretation of the sacred scriptures. And she was judged negatively for this, obviously. This book was considered unorthodox. It was considered unorthodox, of course, by official opinion in religious circles, of course. In this booklet, she reflects on the inadequacies of religious discourse, which she believed was cast in outmoded linguistic forms that vitiated progress in knowledge, because she insisted, she was a believer in religious discourse, in religion, an Anglican, but she said that, and I agree, religion to be valid must be religion in dialogue with the sciences, with philosophy and with life. Otherwise, it will lose its religious spirit, its message. So, on closely examining language and meaning, she denounced the situation of pervasive linguistic confusion, also in theological discourse, at the level of usage, which she associated at a theoretical level with a widespread misconception of language as a system of fixed meanings. She would say, you cannot read the Bible literally. the language is metaphorical, and we have to interpret if we really want to understand the message that the sacred scriptures wants to get through to humanity. We have to interpret and update beyond outmoded expression. This could only, and remember, this was the time of Darwinism, of evolutionary theory, which caused an uprising in the church, in dogma. But Welby was very, very interested in progress in science and saying we need to listen to Darwinism and evolutionary theory. And she was critical. She wasn't accepting anything passively. But obviously, she said, you know, the ecclesiasts do not detain power over science. We have to listen to science, even when a question of religion. So consequently, she elaborated her critique of language with a special focus on figurative language. All discourse, including religious, could be updated and made ever more significant in light of scientific discovery. Science and religion are not enemies, as far as she was concerned. And in fact, she studied the sciences from a significant perspective with special reference to biology and evolutionary theory, translating, and applying to her theory of meaning. Yes. In links includes, there's a paragraph entitled The Holy Scriptures, in this paragraph, she delineates 4 principles of textual interpretation. And from this point of view, her theory of meaning prefigures 20th century developments, as I said, in sign and interpretation studies. We have an Italian semiotician, Massimo Bonfantini, Augusto Ponce and Massimo Bonfantini worked together a lifetime on sign theory, theory of meaning, and so forth. Massimo has an essay, I think in Italian, I don't think it's available in English, where he explains the development of semiotic studies through the 20th century as a development through 3 phases. The semiotics of decodification or code and message semiotics, semiotics of signification, and the semiotics of interpretation. Interpretation becomes a key concept, as Massimo Bonfantini and Augusto Ponce have dedicated a lifetime to underlining, certainly from the second half of the 20th century onwards. Well, with respect to all that, Welby had pre-announced the importance of interpretation with her own theory of meaning in the 19th century. So the 4 principles, according to Welby, in this very early book, 1980-81, with no claim to being a philosopher or linguist or whatever. 4 principles which revolve around 1, the problem of literal meaning. She says there is no such thing as literal meaning, meaning all of meaning is metaphorical to some degree. The risk of leveling sense and how leveling sense and how topical is that? If you think of what is happening in global communication today, global communication today is all about homologation and leveling of sense. She had already picked it up then, even before developments in communication as they have presented themselves today over the whole globe. A 3rd principle, the importance of context, as I said before. Meaning is given by context in interpretation. And 4, the problem of dialectics, and I would add dialogics, reading Augusto Ponce, Michael Bakhtin, Peirce, of course. The problem of dialogics as a condition for unity. She also recognized the essential role played by contradiction and complementarity among the different levels of sense in the configuration of a thought system. She appeals for the development of an adequate linguistic conscience, foregrounding her critique of language. Yes, she critiques expressions like plain, she introduces expressions like plain common sense meaning. She says there is no such thing as plain meaning. And she introduces the concept of plasticity, the plasticity of meaning, the ambiguity of meaning. She talks about the potential multiplicity of interpretive trajectories with respect to a single text. She advocated the need for testing, alternative meaning, choice of readings, progress in discernment. Also for guarding against imposing one's own interpretation on a text at the cost of failing to enrich it with other interpretative possibilities. Such words, so she says in another section of this book, Links and Clues, it's called The Living Word. The word, she's interested in fact in the word as a live entity, the word in live communication, very Bakhtinian from that point of view, the word in live communication. What does she say? Yes, guiding us against, we must, she says, we ever tend to interpret words by what our natural hearts would mean if we had written them. And these words are echoed in meaning and metaphor. She's underlining the fact that we need to, as I interpret her, and her text allows for the interpretation, we need to listen to the word as it comes from somebody else, to listen to the word in its otherness and not impose our interpretation on that word. At the same time, interpret and develop its meaning. Meaning is alive. It's the result of dialogical interaction. Let's have a look. So another important key concept in Welby's work is translation. She describes her Significs as a philosophy of significance, a philosophy of translation, a philosophy of interpretation. Significs evidences how interpretation, translation, and significance are closely interrelated. In Significs, translation is not only transferal from one historical language to another. Translation is a method for interpretation and understanding, for investigation and discovery, for the acquisition of knowledge and its verification, for the enhancement of meaning and awareness, thus significance, for listening, I would add. In fact, with its focus on the relation between significance, interpretation, and translation, Significs also evidences the relation between translation and the ethical dimension of signifying processes. So translation is a method for interpretation, understanding, critique. And of course, she's interesting. She prefigures, as I was saying at the beginning, translation studies as they developed from the second half, let's say, of the 20th century. Translation is not only about the transition from one language, one historical natural language to another. Translation is much more than that. With Peirce, I would say that the very sign is in translation, and Welby knew that. The sign, meaning is in translation, is in interpretation. And this, and if you consider that the sign is the material of life, the application of what I'm saying is infinite. So therefore, not only interlingual, not only intralingual, but intersemiotic translation, which is not only, as Jakobson had described it, the transition from verbal to non-verbal or non-verbal to verbal, but between any type, order, or system of signs, and certainly among non-verbal sign systems. In a letter to her daughter, Nina Cast, or Mrs. Henry Cast, she says, one side of my work is to bring out the secret of a transfiguring translation. So we translate and we apply and continue translating and transforming. So in this sense, this is why I say her Significs is also a prefiguration of interpretation semiotics and global semiotics. She says, she writes in the preface to her book, Significs and Language, the interpretive function is, in truth, the only one in any direct sense beyond ignored, or at least causally related, the only one in any direct sense, ignored or at least casually related. And yet it is that, the interpretive function, is that which naturally precedes and is the very condition of human intercourse, as of man's mastery of his world. So I also have a citation from, she defines translation, but I won't read that. I've explained her approach to translation. We won't read it now. And how are we going for time? Give me an indication.
It's okay. Please,
I don't
take
want
as much as you need.
Well, I don't want to exhaust people either. So I'll continue for a bit more. But I don't want to be abusive. So, you know, you can, I was going to say, tell me, you can ask me to stop whenever you wish. That's
please,
fine by
Dr.
me.
Petrilli.
Okay. I'll continue because there's plenty.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So, yes, I'll just read parts I think are, you know, as interesting as possible. What does she says, translation in all senses is possible on the basis of a common element among differences, the relation of similarity, whether analogical or homological, uniting things that are apparently unrelated, thereby enhancing meaning. The more varied and rich our employment of sign, these are her words now, the greater our power of interrelating, intertranslating various phases of thought, and thus of coming closer and closer to the nature of things in the sense of starting points for the acquisition of fresh knowledge and new truth. And in this sense, you know, she's a very open-minded scholar, researcher. In this sense, I would say revolutionary. She teaches cultural revolution. In this sense, we need to be open and in dialogue, not to be afraid of confrontation. That is the way to science. It reminds me a bit of Karl Marx when he says, if there's one truth in my life, if there's something I can be sure about, that is that I am not a Marxist. What does that mean? Like Welby, we proceed through systems, and these systems of thought must never be closed. They must always be open to dialogue, to the very extent of disappearing as a system. That is a scientific possibility. So let's have a look. Welby formulated a conception of translation interpretation in her early studies on language and expression, concerned with updating religious beliefs, as we said, in terms of progress in science. She actually publishes a paper entitled, I don't remember the exact title, but Religion and Science are in the title. However, in the framework of Welby's Significs, her philosophy of translation did not privilege a given special language as the target language over others. This reductive approach was adopted subsequently by the unity of science movement, logical empiricism or neo-positivism, and by the Vienna Circle, where all languages, unless the question of formal languages, of course, were to be translated into the language of physics. as the very condition for producing sense. Welby's the point that she made was that translation from one system to another was instrumental to the development of meaning in all its nuances, of knowledge, critical consciousness, and ultimately of significance. To this end, serious discourse can be translated into comical discourse, as indicated by Welby, and vice versa. Verbal or non-verbal discourse can be transferred from one universe of discourse to another, from the social sphere to the political sphere. And she actually did this. She actually translated a text, a scientific text by a physician, by a scientist on the nervous system into, I think, a text in religion, something like that. She said, we need to do this to verify the truth of any thought system. Okay, so another key topic, as I said and have anticipated, is figurative language. So because she says that a figurative language, metaphors, similes, images are pervasive in communication and therefore in verbal language. She says when we talk about the need for a critique of language, we have to consider particularly the need for a critique of figurative language, a critique of imagery, she says. For Welby, ambiguity and plasticity of language are signifying resources. She interrogates definition as a solution, which she considers illusory. And in fact, she doesn't deny the importance of definition, but she distinguishes between what she calls rigid definition and plastic definition, and therefore recognizes the importance, the function of both in studies on language for linguistics, etc. The same with ambiguity. She recognizes the importance of ambiguity for signification. But here again, she distinguishes between ambiguity in the negative sense as that which produces confusion, misinterpretation, misunderstanding, and ambiguity that generates significance. Polysemy, plurivocality, polylogism, a positive attribute constitutive of the word. The word is originally polylogic, she says. It has to be. A condition for expression and understanding. Obscurity, expressive inadequacy, cause of confusion and equivocation is ambiguity in the negative sense. She critiques the fallacy of literal, univocal, plain meaning. This is her language. And the correlate concept of hard, dry facts. So she's saying there's no such thing as hard, dry facts, and there's no such thing as plain meaning. Facts, as we understand them, are the result of interpretation. Our relationship in our language, in the language of interpretation semiotics, the relationship between the word, my understanding, and the object is not direct and never can be. It's mediated by signs, mediated by the stratification of meaning, mediated by experience, mediated by the word of the other. And Victoria Welby is very much in line with all this. Yes, so she evidences the plasticity of language as a value, the polysemy of signs as a value, the metaphorization of meaning, which all this presuppose the logic of otherness logic. This is my interpretation pushing ahead, but it's in her text. Otherness logic as essential to expression. A single text can generate different meanings, requiring experimentation in alternative meanings, as we said before when she was reading the sacred scriptures. At the same time, however, this does not imply that textual meaning is arbitrarily determined by subsequent interpretations. superimposed upon the interpreted text by the interpreting text. From this point of view, Welby contributes to evidencing what in our terminology is the signifying or semiotic materiality of the text. That is, its otherness with respect to any given interpretation. This is in our terminology, semiotic materiality is an absolutely fundamental concept. Semiotic materiality or otherness of the word, otherness of a text, otherness of something else, the alterity or otherness with respect to my interpretation. So we have interpretation and understanding, but there's also always an excess, a gap between my interpretation, my otherness, and the otherness of the word, the text, the event, the experience, the relation that I am interpreting. Signs are always, the word is always endowed with its own alterity with respect to my understanding, my interpretation, my identity. As I said, she was, yes, well, we could go into person, the concept of iconicity and likeness. That's getting a bit complicated now. She talks about the importance of iconicity, the importance of similarity for communication. Let's have a look. When she talks about metaphor, metaphor is connected with the capacity to create iconic relations. Iconic in Peirce's sense of the term. He distinguishes, as we know, between symbol, index, and icon. As such, metaphor involves relations of likeness based on otherness, attraction, affinity among terms that are different from each other. Elective likeness, agapastic likeness, to evoke Charles Peirce's language, likeness based on the logic of otherness, by contrast to likeness based on the logic of identity. Likeness is another, similarity, resemblance is another ambiguous term. We need to explain what we need by a term like similarity, just as we need to explain what we need by a term like identity, or another term, common term, what could that be? Communication. All these terms that we take for granted are, as Welby teaches us, polysemic, ambiguous, and we need to disambiguate when we are analyzing and trying to understand. Welby not only theorized likeness in terms of analogy, but also in terms of homology. This is a term she borrows from the life sciences, from biology. The homological method consists in relating things that are distant from each other. That is, in tracing a common core, uniting things that appear different and completely unrelated. Following scientific research in the fields of biology, psychology, and language studies, Welby identified a homological relation between organic life and consciousness, between organic life systems and language or verbal science systems. She says, her words, in her book, What is Meaning? Now, however, it may be said that we have to leave the field of analogy, analogy is surface likeness, and enter that of homology. Homology is likeness at the genetical structural level, which does not necessarily emerge on the superficial level. Beyond surface resemblances and associations, the homological method searches for profound genetical, structural, functional, and dynamical relationships among the terms of reference in question. And here I have to mention Ferruccio Rossilandi. Ferruccio Rossilandi develops the homological method. He identifies in philosophy of language and semiotics, and he identifies a homological relation between the utterance and the artifact, the linguistic the linguistic artifact and the non-linguistic artifact, linguistic work and non-linguistic work. He identifies the similarity, the connection, homological, genetical, structural connection in work, in the category of work. We could also say interpretation, interpretive work. Welby warned against the tendency to exchange analogy on or surface relation of similarity with homology or genetico-structural similarity. On the relation between analogy, homology, and translation, understood as interpretive, cognitive method, translation as method, what she calls intertranslation, she claims that, her words, there is a method both of discovering, testing, and using analogy, and in some cases, homology, the value of which does not yet seem to be recognized. And this may be called, in an extended sense, translation. Translation. I'll jump ahead. I'd love to say many other things, but I think we'll push ahead. Let's have a look. On iconicity, lasciamo stare, andiamo qui. The dynamic, generative, and procedural logic of Welby's Significs, as much as of Peirce's Semiotics, teaches us that knowledge and truth are neither absolute nor neutral, but multifaceted and figurative, plurioriented, pluriaccentuated. Discourse is always pervaded by values, and Welby knew that, and she taught that. Values, what today I would say is, I would call ideology, and that opens another chapter. In becoming, knowledge and truth are in becoming through the sign network, and as such always open to questioning, dialogical interpretation, translation. Instead, to the extent that it is trapped in the fixity of meaning and in the oppositional logic of conceptual paradigms, doxa, become dogma, is dangerous. This is my words, my interpretation, even life-threatening. As when our children are jailed for antisocial behavior, or somehow alienated for not conforming, or even executed for critiquing and rebelling, or simply allowed to drown quietly in the Mediterranean. Mother sense. This is another central concept in Victoria Welby's work. Mother sense. It's an original concept which she develops in particular from 1904 onwards. I've published her papers in my book, Signifying and Understanding, which is this. Let's have a look if I can show it to you. Signifying Understanding. So I do have a chapter there on with her papers. I'd rather people read Welby than me, you know. That's why I did this book. I put in as much as I could, and there's much more to be done. Absolutely, for the sake of readers and making materials available as best as I could. So mother sense, synonyms are primal sense, primary sense, original sense, racial sense, native sense. She had actually formulated the concept about in around 1890, but then worked systematically on the concept from 1904 onwards. Mother sense is described as the generating matrix of the human capacity for signifying processes, for experience, language, and knowledge acquisition, for the development of consciousness and subjectivity, ultimately of worldview. I, in fact, with Augusto Ponzio, we have related and developed her concept of mother sense in terms of modeling, primary modeling, as elaborated in global semiotics, in dialogue with biology. And that's another thing we can't go into now. Mother sense as a modeling device, as a human primary modeling device. Do you want me to stop, or shall I continue a bit more? You okay?
Please continue. It's an incredible.
Okay. Okay, so let's have a look. Mother sense is described as an inheritance common to all of humanity without gender limitations. It is the generating matrix of the human capacity for signification, experience, expression, knowledge, consciousness, and worldview, for interpretation and creativity. We all owe our lives to our mothers and to mother sense. The faculty of critique and rational construction, the rationalizing intellect, presupposes mother sense, its condition of possibility. Welby distinguishes between mother sense and father reason, sense and intellect, two modalities in sense generation, in modeling sense, though strictly interrelated in relations of complementarity, neither logic of reason, nor sense of logic, nor well-reasoned logic, nor logic sensing, but reason becoming and sense becoming beyond bivalent logic. Sexual identity is ambiguous, consonant with Peirce's logic of vagueness. And just let me say here, with Peirce, and Welby is in the same direction, we can make a distinction between reason and reasonableness. Peirce and Welby talk of the need of reasonableness, thematized reasonableness, which we could explain in just a few words as reason with otherness logic at the heart, reason that is dialogic, rationality that is open to otherness logic. If reason is, it closes in upon itself on identity logic, it becomes unreasonable. And I could also mention Charles Morris here. Charles Morris actually, he continues under certain aspects Peirce's thought. Charles Morris actually publishes a book called The Open Self, where he thematizes this whole problematic of open identity by contrast to closed identity. So, while criticizing feminist movements of her day, Welby at once acknowledged the Significian, thus the pragmatist, referring in particular to Peirce's pragmatism, with a form of humanism that arises from mother sense. She conceived a project for the emancipation and development of humanity in its wholeness, beginning with improvement of the expressive instruments at one's disposal through an adequate education. And this is the whole point of insisting on her theory of meaning, improving expression and communication. She could see the connection between expression, communication, and human behavior. In this light, feminist movements they were arising then at the same time that she was working, second half of the 19th century, let's say. Feminist movements that made claims exclusively to the rights of women, the cult of effeminacy, she says, seemed reductive to her. She warned militant feminists against the danger of what she says calls monkeyish imitation. Her correspondence with Mary Everest Bull, for example, is interesting, but she has correspondence with the feminists of the time. And this is the sense of her observations. The problem is, you know, she says we must not allow ourselves to be trapped by identity, I would say. And feminism is important. She was obviously shared their values, but beware of closing in on identity. The risk there is of imitating what we are trying to overcome. That's why she speaks of the cult of effeminacy and the monkeyish imitation. Monkey's imitation of the male behavior they were contesting, while the ruling female, once the ruling female comes to life, in turn would soon be imitated by man, thereby favoring the reign of power which instead we are critiquing. We need to critique the reign of power and violence over good and beauty and truth. Welby appreciated feminist movements with their commitment to values and practices that she endorsed. But at the same time, she insisted on the broader vision for the development of a new, what we call a new humanism, the humanism of alterity, the humanism of otherness, for the improvement of interpersonal relations beyond division among sexes and subjectivities. Therefore, whilst acknowledging the importance of feminist movements, Welby addressed the so-called woman question as part of a plan to promote the principles of interrelatedness, mutual understanding, listening, and hospitality among human beings. That is, among unique human beings in their singularity as each one outside and beyond identity affiliations, outside mutual opposition and competition. The maternal, let's go have a look. What Welby understands by mother sense is already experimented, established, and developed, beginning from the gift of language. The gift, as she speaks about language as a gift, language and the relationship it implies, the mother and child, mother and infant, from infari, without the word infari, who does not speak. And here I have to remember Genevieve Vaughan, who has written a book on the gift of language. Sorry. We all, male and female, know what mother sense really is, even if only pre-consciously, at the level of the body, with its knowing through, feeling, sensation, perception, intuition, racial wisdom. So she thematizes the need to put the body back into the idea. My understanding is semiotic materiality. She was writing at a time where there was a division between the life of the mind and the spirit and the life of the body. She knows full well that they are united and they must be put back together. And to do that, we must put the mother back into philosophy and ideas, the body back into philosophy and ideas. She speaks of racial wisdom. We are all familiar with hospitality as gifted by the maternal, with the welcome. In this sense, we all understand the sense of true friendship, that is to say, the capacity for giving without returns, outside do ut des logic paradigms. Without hospitality, without listening to the other, this is my interpretation going ahead, without interest for the other, without apprehension for the other, there is no such thing as togetherness, as living together, whether among males or females. In spite of Welby's generosity in attributing the maternal to the male gender as well, the fact is that the world as it was and as it still is a man-made world, a world made of real men, a virile world, a world of war, where peace is simply the peace of a truce in preparation for taking up arms. So it was, and so it still is, to this day, a world where combat has even become preventive war, paradoxically a means, a pathway towards peace. What a contradiction in terms. Such problematics involve us all and are still relevant today. They are human, to evoke an expression used by Nietzsche, all too human. So then there's another key concept, the concerning subjectivity, her analysis of subjectivity. She's a precursor, as Mary Everest Ball is a precursor of, I would say, studies in psychology and psychiatry. She speaks about the ident and the ephemeron, what we would call multiplex identity. mother sense, and otherness are central concepts in Welby's description of subjectivity and its dialogical nature. She focused on the meaning implications of such expressions as conscious identity, conscious being, and human identity. Coming to awareness implies becoming aware of one's own otherness, beyond the otherness of otherness. And this also evokes language introduced by Emmanuel Levinas. In her analysis of the problem of subjectivity, Welby made an important distinction between I and self, describing the complex and articulated relation between these terms, I and self. And she's very much in line with Charles Peirce and his analysis of the subject of subjectivity. Subjectivity, as we know in Peirce, is also multiplex and open identity. As it emerges from the dialogic relation among its parts, identity of the subject is modeled in this relation as plurifaceted, plurivocal, multiplex identity. So let's go ahead. So then there's another point I bring to the attention which concerns education, educating for meaning and significance. I won't go into that now, but she's interested in education because she believes that these concepts that we are talking about and many others must be transmitted to people from childhood. She's saying that children, that first, on one hand, children are our masters. They teach us how we should, the attitude that we should develop towards life and never forget, a questioning attitude. Children are always asking questions. And she says we need to recover that dimension of life, the child dimension, this capacity for questioning, looking for answers and questioning. And this we can do in the kindergarten. I think she's also behind Montessori's conception of education and how to introduce children into the world and into education. Her lifelong inquiry into language, logic, and meaning was accompanied by her lifelong interest in education, understood as education in signifying value, the way to critical thinking and responsibility, relevant to all from early infancy. According to Welby, both teaching and learning procedures were largely founded on the capacity to establish connections and comparisons, likenesses and correspondence between different facts, phenomena, experiences, and expressions. Indeed, the first analogy and the basis of which all other analogies may be constructed is that between one's own mind and that of others. In Welby's words, we forget that we cannot say one word to our fellow without assuming the analogy between his mind and our own mind. A significant education would focus on developing the power of interpretation and ability to express facts from different points of view under different aspects. The student, whether child or adult, would learn to make distinctions and to detect fallacy, error, confusion, and so forth. To educate for meaning, which for Welby was to educate for sense, meaning, and significance, also means to educate for fitness, freedom, beauty, grace, and dignity. And she says in her letter to Peirce, what does she say? All human beings, whether male or female, are indistinctly endowed with mother sense or primal sense, the a priori condition for the development of critical consciousness, creativity, and responsibility. Welby maintained that mother sense could be developed through a correct significant education, and even denounced educational systems of the time for tending to what she calls educate, rather than educate, pushing people to the outside into the relation with the other. Dialogue. So I will now pass on to and conclude to the final part, which shows how I work on, how we, with Augusto Ponzio, work on Significs in the direction, developing it in the direction of semioethics. So are you interested? Shall I go ahead? I could stop here if you like. Yes? Okay. Allora. Just let me drink a drop of water, okay? 1 second. Thank you. No, vabbè, questo. Questi mi fanno parlare assai. Va bene. Eccomi. Allora, andiamo. Significs and semioethics. Significs is that discipline that teaches us to ask questions. What does it signify? What does it mean? In what sense? So what is meaning? At the meta level, she's working out what meaning is, how meaning works from the point of view of the science, the meta language. But then it teaches us to interrogate life, experience, human relationship. What does it mean? What does it signify? What is the sense? Nor is it surprising that this woman has never entered the pantheon or genealogical tree of the fathers, of course, of the science of signs and language, in spite of the influence she exerted on scholars such as those listed above, and many more. So a possible translation in Victoria Welby's sense and development on her Significs is what, with Augusto Ponzio, here we go, eccolo. What, with Augusto Ponzio, we have proposed to take semioethics. What does it signify? What's the sense? These are questions that Welby induces one to ask in the face of any form of expression, verbal and non-verbal, of any piece of human behavior, of all languages, whether ordinary or special languages. Welby invites us to interrogate the sense of words, of human practices, of the worlds we contribute to constructing, thanks to mother sense, thanks to human modeling. What does a given discourse, text, behavior mean? What's the sense, the significance of a given social program? What does education imply? Why poverty? Why exploitation? Why war? What are the implications involved in the progress of science? What's the use of definition, dogmatism? Why keep difference at a distance? Why isolate the disobedient with respect to dominant ideology? What is the sense of war? How do we respond to all this? These are all questions that Significs teaches us to ask. And let me just add here, remember that violence, war, repression is a sign of fear. It's telling us of the weakness from the point of view of semiotic materiality, of the weakness of the aggressor. The aggressor needs to aggress, to repress that rebellious student, because that aggressor knows of his weakness to the point of having to repress and eliminate a student, for example. With a focus on human dignity, Welby promoted and theorized the development of critical consciousness and interpretive capacity. Such themes are accompanied throughout her writings by reflection on the inevitable connection of science, values, responsibility, freedom. In the language of semioethics, with the capacity for hospitality and listening to the other alien to self. Significs is rich in implications for the ethics of communication, indeed a prefiguration. In dialogue with the Persian tradition in sign and language studies, with Charles Morris's focus on the relation of signs to values, with Thomas Sebeok's global semiotics and developments in biosemiotics, with Mikhail Bakhtin's dialogism, with Emmanuel Levinas's philosophy of otherness, with studies on signs and ideology as developed by Adam Schaff, Ferruccio Rossilandi, and Augusto Ponzio, interpretation semiotics, as it has characterized our lifelong research, the implications of significs have been developed with semioethics. The semioetic approach to communication underlines the importance of listening to the other, of difference, of caring for the other, of dialogue, of recognition of otherness as the basis of communication. Value theory is essential for an ethics of communication, a semioethics of communication, whether a question of individual or community, of interpersonal relations or relations through social media, characteristic of the global world today. Communication is oriented always by values, ideologies, and social planning. Rather than alienation with respect to the social relations of communication, whether in the private or public sphere, healthy communication requires critique, creativity, consciousness of the values informing human action, and general signifying, or to recall Welby's terminology, significating behavior. According to the logic of Significs, which is in line with the logic of a new form of humanism, the humanism of otherness or alterity, they are synonyms, to take responsibility for the other is inextricably connected with creative love for the other. I repeat, creative love, it's a word we must not be afraid of. Care for the other, and therefore with the capacity for proposing new and better worlds with and for the other. Proceeding with Welby and beyond Welby in a globalized world, we aim for the construction of worlds which are no longer founded on difference, understood in terms of identity, difference as closed difference, monological, monolithic difference, monological, monolithic identity. Remember, with Welby, with Peirce, with Morris, at the heart of identity is otherness. If we're here together now, it is because we are motivated, pushed towards the other. Why am I speaking if not for you, for the other? Why are you listening if not for the other? Thus understood, difference means to construct worlds on the basis of identity separations. Difference means to construct worlds on the basis of identity separations if difference is understood as identity, closed identity. Such logic inevitably involves, and difference can pertain to gender, ethnic group, religion, ideology, whatever. Such logic, closed identity, closed difference, inevitably involves the need to defend rights and interests connected with difference as subtended by the egocentric logic of identity and belonging, affiliation, in the sense of affiliation to an identity and not to another, even to the point of accepting the logic of war, which, impossible to deny, characterizes the global world today. In contrast, from the perspective of Significs, or what we propose to call semioethics, it is possible to work for a world that is founded on difference, understood in terms of otherness and dialogism, rather than of dominion of one difference over another, of one identity over another. Such logic involves the capacity, to stay together on the basis of intercorporeal dialogue and co-participation among differences, even when they clash. Another term for dialogism, for dialogue, is intercorporeity, as Bakhtin teaches us. When we talk about dialogism, dialogue, we're not talking about the simple exchange of rejoinders between two identities. We're talking about this inevitable, inescapable condition of interconnectedness with the other, of intercorporeality in the Bakhtinian sense, if you like. Global peace and freedom cannot be separated from the relation of global involvement with the other, without identities, barriers, or alibis, from the relation of responsibility for the other, responsivity, responsibility, of dialogic responsiveness towards the other. And according to this logic, to be committed to human rights means to be committed always and without reserve to the rights of the other. And this is where Augusto Poncio's work on the concept, lifelong work on the concept of alterity and otherness, interpreting Bakhtina Levinas in particular, is absolutely fundamental and life-saving. The gift is a constant theme throughout Welby's writings, both as the object of discourse, when she predicates such values as love and care for the other, compassion, justice, and patience as the guiding values for social practice. But even more significantly, she identifies gift logic as a constitutive component in the relation among signs, in the generation of signifying processes and practices. The gift can be associated with the concept of otherness, alterity, absolute otherness, absolute alterity. Otherness and excess, overflow with respect to identity logic are recognized as determining factors in the dynamics of interpretive processes and therefore in the development of expressive systems, including verbal language. This is all one with the dynamics of the constitution of subjectivity, the development of interpersonal relationships and experience of the world. A major problem today is the logic of identity, where identity is understood and practiced as closed identity, ready to expunge the other, to reject the other, to repress the other, thus violent and repressive identity. This is a worldwide problem and a characteristic of globalization. A world dominated by communication reduced to the status of communication production, communication reduced to the status of communication production, which is the subject of a book recently published by Augusto Poncio. But there is a way out. It's called otherness, non-indifferent otherness. And here I have to remember Pope Francis. Pope Francis has spoken repeatedly about the problem of difference in difference. He speaks about the globalization of indifference, and the globalization of indifference is a symptom of social illness today. So I think Pope Francis is a great example of what a signification and a semioethicician is about or could be about today. So I was saying there is a way out. It's called otherness, non-indifferent otherness, where purport, as Welby avers, is significance for life, thus singularity, where each life is a value, each single life is a value, each other in its uniqueness and unrepeatability. On the background, the materiality of life, thus, in our work, materialistic semiotics. Materiality is otherness. When I say otherness, read semiotic materiality. The materiality, the capacity for resistance of otherness. Global semiotics, interpretation semiotics, semioethics. The last bit, and promise I finish. Implications for the semioethics of communication, which I've in part read, so I'll just go to the end. The communication globe is not adequately understood in descriptive terms alone. To evidence the relation between communication, human action, and values is to expand strictly epistemological cognitive boundaries of signs and meaning into the ethical pragmatic, where signs and values are thematized in their interconnectedness, signs and values, signs and ideology. The implications are enormous. The other cannot be evaded, and indifference is neither wise nor desirable, as the world is showing us, the whole global world scene. A semioethics of communication calls for critical thinking, responsible behavior, and responsiveness to the other, not only for the sake of human understanding, but for life and its continuity on the planet. As she writes in a letter to Max Müller, Welby writes he was another correspondent and friend, an ethnologist and anthropologist. We must listen for the whispering echoes of the larger life, for most surely are they quivering all round us, telling us that this brief flash is only worthy of the name of life so far as we look through it into the light of which it is a ray. A major concern for the Significian is care for life, which presupposes care for language. And as we understand from reading Welby, limitation of the term diagnosis to the pathological field is unfortunate. This is because diagnosis conveys the power of knowing through, a human capacity for training in Significs, or in semioethics, if you like, would encourage and consolidate. So in her words, she says, in what is meaning, we must be brought up to take for granted that we are diagnosts, that we are to cultivate to the utmost the power to see real distinctions and to read the signs, however faint, which reveal sense and meaning. Diagnostic may be called the typical process of Significs. So, semioethics today draws inspiration from Welby's Significs and focus on sense, meaning, and significance. From Peirce's interest in ethics, from Morris's in signs and values. Reading them with Bakhtin and Michael Bakhtin and Emmanuel Levinas shows the way to recovering the axiological dimension in studies on human language and behavior beyond strictly descriptive and ideological neutral approaches. All this for responsible action, nowadays urgent, in a world marked by human crisis and ecological emergency. Okay, I've finished. Thank you. Thank you for resisting.
Thank you very much, Dr. Petrilli, for this outstanding, really lucid, conceptually rich and inspiring introduction to Victoria Welby's legacy and to semioethics. It was an incredible experience, and thank you. I would also like to thank Dr. Augusto Ponzio for being present, and you're welcome if you want to join the discussion. I just wanted to ask Dr. Petrilli, you omitted a quotation from Victoria Welby. Would you like to read it?
Something from Victoria Welby. Vuole che leggo qualcosa di Victoria Welby. It's well, shall I don't know, there's her definition of significs, if you like. Shall I read that? Her
Please.
definition.
I think it will be useful for everybody.
So, this is a dictionary definition that she wrote with Stout and Bolden in 1903. She also wrote an encyclopedic definition in 1911, which I don't have here now. So significs implies a careful distinction between sense or signification, meaning or intention, and significance or ideal worth. It will be seen that the reference of the first is mainly verbal or sensal, of the second volitional, intention, and the third moral, ethics, what I call ethics. We speak of some event, the significance of which cannot be overrated. It would be impossible in such a case to substitute the sense or the meaning of such an event without serious loss. Significs treats of the relation of signs in the widest sense possible to each of these. So it's the relation between sign and sense, sign and meaning, sign and significance, as I explained before. 2, a proposed method of mental training, aiming at the concentration of intellectual activities on that which is implicitly assumed to constitute the primary and ultimate value of every form of study. what is at present indifferently called its meaning or sense, import or significance. Significs affords also a means of calling attention to the backwardness of language in comparison with other modes of human communication. She was interested in communication, not only through verbal language, and to the urgent need of stimulating thought, critical thinking, by the creation of a general interest in the logical and practical, as well as the aesthetical value of all forms of expression. So logic, pragmatics, aesthetics. And it provides a convenient general term under which to work perhaps for an international consensus and for a natural check upon willful waste or misuse of the existing resources of language by bringing to bear upon it a certain deterrent of social and academic constraint. She's a free thinker. She didn't go through a conventional educational system. Significs makes practically for the detection of lurking confusion or specious assertion in directions where the discipline of formal logic would help less directly and simply. But it suggests that this study, so far from superseding or displacing or even distracting attention from the disciplines already recognized, would rather render them more effectual because more vitally significant. So she wasn't intending to replace anything, but pushing ahead and making things better, even at the level of study and understanding. More obviously related to ordinary experience and interest. She was interested in the everyday person, in everyday life. It would also bring out the moral value, ethical value of greater respect for the traditions and the future. Traditions and future, they're not separate. They move together. And would in fact, while preparing the ground for an expansion of the limits of articulate expression, tend to create a linguistic conscience which must beneficially react upon thought, thus bringing about gradually and naturally a spontaneous consensus in definition. She distinguished between rigid definition and plastic definition. Much work is already being done in this direction. Significs as a science would centralize and coordinate, it's a method, interpret, interrelate, and concentrate the efforts to bring out meanings in every form, and in so doing to classify the various applications of the signifying property clearly and distinctly. Okay, so that's an example of her writing. Okay, there's a lot.
Thank you.
There was a text I wanted to read to you, but I can't because I only have it in Italian. It's on war. She was interested in what was happening in the world and working for a better world. And she discusses the problem of war. And she, at the time, it was the 19th century, she was criticizing Europe for not doing enough in the sense of peace. I've translated Welby's works into Italian. There are two volumes in particular, which I think are really good. This is the most recent one. Senso, significato, significatività, sense, meaning, significance. And then there's another one which reads and translates her earlier writings. And in this book, I'm also publishing a monograph in Italian on Welby. And in there, I've translated this piece on war in Italian. I don't have it in English. Questo l'ho già fatto vedere. Yes, okay. Okay. Gina.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We will move forward then, and I would like to introduce, we have today two commentators, Dr. Clara Chapdelaine-Feliciati and Dr. Zayed Hurley. I would introduce first Dr. Clara, and then Dr. Zayed, and give a word to each of you. Dr. Clara Chapdelaine-Feliciati is Associate Professor at Xi'an, Jiaotong, I'm sorry Liverpool University, and a license at lawyer, barrister and solicitor with the Law Society of Upper Canada. She holds a PhD in international law from Oxford University, where she applied Victoria Welby's Significs theory and Susan Petrilli's and Augusto Ponzio's Semioethics theory. She also holds a Bachelor of Laws and Bachelor of Civil Law from McGill University and a Master of Laws from King's College London. She conducts research on legal semiotics and legal significs in English and French and decodes the content of international human rights treaties. Her forthcoming book, The Status of the Girl Child Under International Law, a semiotic analysis, will be published by Cambridge University Press. Dr. Chapdelaine-Feliciati, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction and for this fascinating presentation. I believe, Professor Petrilli, that this could turn into a series of seminars on Welby's work and how it could be applied to different disciplines, for that matter. As a legal scholar, I've applied, in fact, Significs theory as well as the threefold laws of meaning, or the meaning triad, which are extremely useful to deconstruct the master discourse, the discourse of master signifiers, such as lawyers, policymakers, and judges. And this applies to all fields. In communication, it could be the mainstream media that many people use, or social media as well. If I may, I'd like to just briefly start the talk, because since we're celebrating John Deely's contribution to semiotics, I'd like to quote John Deely on Victoria Welby and yourself in his article entitled Lady Welby and Lady Petrilli in the Semiotica Centennial Special Issue for Victoria Welby from 2013. Now I quote, "It is more than fitting that Susan Petrilli, who pioneered the development of semioethics within the major tradition of semiotics, is the one to whom Victoria Welby is indebted for being brought to the center stage of this major development." And I believe that today you not only underscored that Victoria Lady Welby is the foremother of modern semiotics, as you say, but that her work is especially important today. The importance of criticizing and questioning, interrogating dogma, of not passively obeying orders, and also the importance of not viewing others as the other, and the issue of otherness. Something you've mentioned in terms of criticizing the language and terminology, I found interesting. It made me think of the power of silence that Welby underscores. And if I may quote briefly, she says that silence is often a most significant declaration and a most misleading one. And you've noted this also. You've dedicated a chapter on the signs of silence in your work. So perhaps if you would like to talk a little bit about silence with Welby and generally with regards to semioethics. And I believe it would be interesting, you've mentioned this at the end of your presentation, but perhaps to elaborate a bit on the reason behind semioethics theory, the relationship with significs, and the volitional aspect, the meaning intention that you've mentioned before. So perhaps if you wish to do so, and very briefly also, when you've talked about war and the dangers of misinterpretation, this made me think of works by Victoria Welby when she was very concerned, and I quote, with a mutual deafness, dumbness, and blindness, which is the mental condition of our modern Babel. And she was worried that this could lead to quarrel and destruction. And for this purpose, she was calling for the establishment of an international court of linguistic arbitration, as you've noted in your work as well, to arm ourselves with the weapons of expression of far greater power and perfection than any yet attained. So the idea of communicating with one another. So perhaps I will leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Should I respond to that? Yes. Yes, the power of silence. So we're not talking about the absence of noise. We're talking about silence as a sign, the power of nonverbal signs, Welby's theory of meaning applies to verbal and non-verbal signs. It applies to communication, which is verbal and non-verbal. And in that sense, I've also read her in the light of Bakhtin, and Bakhtin makes that very interesting distinction, and not only Bakhtin, but also Barthes. Silence, which is not signifying silence, just the absence of noise, and silence that is full of meaning and can be powerful, far more powerful than discourse. It connects me to the concept of semiotic materiality and war, for example. If you consider, I mean, these are considerations that come out of interpretation semiotics and all the references that I've mentioned, but consider in war, we've got war going on all over the globe at the moment. The Iraqi war, beginning of the 90s, another big example, ex-Yugoslavia, and so forth and so forth. It's unending. War is unending. And yet we can bomb cities. We can bomb countries, destroy, as is happening in Ukraine at the moment, for example. It's easy to demolish the physical, organic materiality, right? But what resists far more, what is far stronger, what persists is semiotic materiality, the idea, the values, the call for peace. So I might destroy a city, but the idea of peace continues, and it travels through the centuries. This is what we mean by semiotic materiality. Victoria Welby was committed through her theory of sign to the well-being of society, to the well-being of communities, to the well-being of ever larger communities through dialogue. She doesn't necessarily use the same terminology that I use. I mean, you know, she lived, what, 150 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever. But that is the logic behind her work, this attention towards the world, towards life, in the spirit of caring for and persistence in healthy terms, which means living together peacefully is possible. I don't know. Does that answer what you were? Is that okay? Do you want me to say
absolutely? No, this is perfect. And perhaps if you wanted to briefly talk about meaning intention, when we talk about the meaning triad, sense, meaning, significance, meaning intention was really an important contribution on the part of Welby, because many others had not looked at their intention behind.
No, here again, you know, reading in light of our work, when we're talking about communication, the point is that communication cannot be reduced to meaning intention. Meaning intention is certainly, communicating on the basis of an intention is certainly part of communication, an important part, but it's not the most part of communication. Most of what we communicate unintentionally. We are producing unintentional meanings. Here we're more in the sphere of significance. Rossi Landi, in fact, had said, he talks about the postal package theory of communication. We can't reduce communication to the status of a message that we want to send from one post office and receive at the other end. we receive the package, open it, and draw out of it, what we put in there. No, global semiotics teaches us that communication is mostly unintentional communication. Not only the most of what we communicate is not through verbal signs, as much as verbal signs are very present, even when we are speaking. Obviously, a great part of communication is happening that we're not aware of, and which verbal signs are dependent upon. And in fact, Sigmund Freud was one, we could call him a crypto-semiotician, talks about the interpretation of dreams, right? Well, that is an area where all these unintentional signs emerge and become very, very, very evident, and are very much a part of what we understand as intentional communication, but which in fact is full of implied meaning, implicit meaning, or unintended meanings, and so forth. So I was talking about the development of semiotic studies across the 20th century, and this is what happens. There's a focus on intentional communication in an initial phase, but then there's a critique of that model of communication, and we enter signification semiotics, which underlines the importance of unintentional communication. And then through to interpretation or significance semiotics, which valorizes all this aspect of communication, and which Welby certainly had prefigured with her concept of significance, which goes beyond intentional communication and looks also at the effects that intentional communication can have upon human action, unintended effects.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And in fact, it relates, another aspect you mentioned that's very interesting is the plain meaning, that she was very concerned with everyone believing.
The fact is, this is interesting, the plain meaning, the context. If you say, for example, a common example in the classroom that we give, the book is on the table, right? The book is on the table. What does that mean? What does that mean? I mean, yes, there's a sense, there's a grammatical meaning, there's a sense that responds even at the level of the body. The book is on the table, but what does it mean in intentional terms? The book is on, what does that mean? Oh, I haven't lost it, it's there. Or pick the book and just pick up the book and go, okay, it's yours, right? It's implied, but it's there, the intentional meaning. And that intentional meaning varies. It can be anything. The book is on the table. That utterance becomes a sign in live communication, right? And its meaning is plastic and changes depending on meaning intention. And then there's also the significance. So what are the consequences of this meaning intention? The book is on the table, so everybody stops looking for it. Here it is at last. Or the book is on the table, and so he picks it up and goes away. No more excuses to keep on staying there in her presence. Okay? Do the same thing, for example, this is language, the importance of understanding, analyzing meaning in live communication. I love you. What does that mean? I love you. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. And an aspect you've mentioned also with regards to meaning intention is that through even my own research and what others have done in international law is to examine the travaux préparatoires, the discussions between state representatives as they negotiate the wording applied to shape rights internationally, and the debates and what is said in presence of others, what is unofficially said behind closed doors. So that's also very interesting.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Absolutely.
so much.
Yeah.
And maybe briefly, I would like to leave time to the other commentator. If you could just maybe explain a little bit the origins of semioethics for those of you who are not familiar with it. the relationship a bit, if you have time? Yes.
Yes, well, Sam, just very, very quickly, semioethics is a term invented with Augusto Ponzio. Where is he? Yeah. And well, it is an approach, an attitude, an orientation to the study of science and language that, as I said in my presentation, develops out of Welby, certainly, but Emmanuel Levinas, Morris, Peirce, all these authors that are in our work. And it is, it underlines with Morris, for example, the importance of in our analysis of science, language, meaning, communication, of the relation to values and ideology. Language is never neutral, and we need to understand. We think, for example, look at communication today. We have this sense of freedom that communicating so easily in the world gives us, right? We can be in contact with any part of the world in virtual time, which is empowering and gives a sense of freedom. But how free are people who are eternally connected with their social media and social networks? Is there a space for critical awareness, free thinking? Is there awareness of the role of dominant ideology? Welby speaks of homologating, leveling of meaning. That's a big problem today with global communication. Global communication, technology are fantastic, absolutely vital. It's not about stopping progress, obviously. It is about, though, with semiotics and as Significs and as all these philosophers teach us, of using the means that empower us to the to our advantage, to the advantage of life. And this is only possible by developing an active attitude, one that knows how to interrogate. We need to stop and think. We need to take responsibility. We need to get over the limits of identity, of short-sighted, selfish identity. We need to understand that, what our values are. What are the primary values? What drives life? What drives communication? What drives, why are we here together? How can we work together for a better world? Is that okay? Does Augusto want to say?
Perfect answer.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I will let the other commentator join in.
All of you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clara. I would like now to introduce Dr. Zoe Hurley, who was also very kind to accept our invitation. Thank you. We are very grateful for you being here. So Dr. Zoe Hurley is a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and an assistant professor in the College of Interdisciplinary Studies at Zayed University, Dubai. Her work focuses on semiotics, international feminisms, power, and visual communication. She is the president of the Gulf Association for Semiotic Studies, which is an associate member of the International Association for Semiotic Studies. Dr. Hurley published articles in leading academic journals, including New Media and Society, Feminist Media Studies, and many others. And I would like specifically mention her upcoming monograph, Social Media Influencing in the City of Likes, Dubai and the Post-Digital Condition. The monograph expands semiotic critique of social media and its role in the global visual economy. Thank you very much again, Dr. Hurley. Please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Yulia. And yeah, thank you, Susan. That was just an absolutely tremendous, enriching, erudite and informative discussion. And it's actually quite late at night where I am, but it was, so engaging, and it's great just to see such, an engaged audience, and that is credit to, I think your enthusiasm for Welby's work and for semioethics. And I'm going to make I would like to give a brief summary of what we've heard today, and then I'd like to give a very brief comment on the relevance of, or even the significance of what we've heard today. So firstly, in summary, and it's, obviously Susan is an incredibly hard act to follow, and we've heard a lot. So these points are broad. We've listened to we've had a broad theoretical overview of Welby's work. And I think that's really important, because relatively little is known about this very important figure. So it's very important to get a sense of the size and breadth and depth of Welby's work. And I'm really happy that that we've had this time to kind of breathe into this enormous space of the kind of Welbyan genealogy, which is tremendous. So in doing this, Susan's also highlighted key aspects. There are about 9 or more in total, some of those really important points. And, I think any one of those areas, are a study, are a thesis, are a book in themselves. So there's so much to build on. So I think that those key points are very important theoretical nodes that scholars can look to, and that everyone who's interested should be building on. Another very important thing that we've had done for us today is to have Lady Welby's work contextualized in relation to the Victorian age. And I think, Welby herself was very interested in context, and it is very important to contextualize her work. And I think in doing that, we'll appreciate a number of things, will help to kind of understand what might seem sometimes to be her conservatism, but we'll also appreciate the radicalism of Welby's work, and that the theoretical categories that she was exploring and expanding. Susan also spoke about the present application of Welby's work to our current age, and also the future potential. And she also summarized the importance of semioethics as an area of semiotics, that I think addresses these crucial ethical issues of so many wicked problems that are intractable and difficult to resolve. And I think that semioethics is a really important lens to start thinking about those multidimensional problems. Now, moving on to the relevance of the Welbyan genealogy and Susan's work, I'd just like to read out a really brief question that Susan raises in a 1988 article, Semiotics as Semioethics in the Era of Global Communication. And she asks a question in this article, and she says, she's asking a question about the difference between reproducing the world as it is, or working for its transformation in view of the dangers it presents for life over the planet. And I think these are really important questions that we should be each asking ourselves, in terms of scholarship, and why are we doing it? Why is any one of us engaged in this work? Why is any author or human being? What are they putting out into the world, and what kind of difference are they making? Are they just reproducing the status quo, the dogma, the doxa, or are they interrogating it in the way that definitely Victoria Welby was, and Susan Petrilli is? So I'd also like to make a comment about Dr. Petrilli and her just, you know, it's hard to do it justice in a few words, the contribution over several decades that she has made to bringing Welby's work, you know, to light, to rescuing it from literally from, you know, these archives where a lot of the work is scattered, it's poorly stored, nobody knows about it. So that's one aspect. And then all her own writing and interpretation and translation and literal translation into English and into Italian, and making Welby's work, well, reminding the semiotics community of Victoria Welby, who they would have, you know, been aware of. And, you know, in Welby's time, as Susan, you know, put the case, it wasn't that she wasn't known. She had a huge network of over 450 intellectuals, the world's leading intellectuals. She wrote commentaries in things like the New York Times. She was a social reformer. She wrote articles. She gave lectures. She was an aristocrat. She was known within various different circles, and she mixed in different social classes, and she traveled the world. And she really helps Peirce to develop his ideas. And, you know, when Peirce's letters to Welby were published, I think lots of semioticians were quite relieved as well, because it helped us all to understand Peirce. It made it a bit more digestible, and I think we saw a different side of Peirce, and you know, Welby obviously really bore that out in his writing, so that was really, really good. Now, consequently, I think this moment when Welby's letters were not published, so just only Peirce, it was just one-sided kind of publication, so the dialogue was broken down. And from that point, you know, Welby was just indisputably marginalized and backgrounded, and this, you know, would be because of her gender. Now, as a result of that, I think that the intellectual paradigms that she's involved in have suffered as a result. And many of the issues that Welby was wrestling with at the turn of the century are things that we continue to confront. And many of the debates raging through the culture wars are things that Welby was trying to address and work out through dialogue with her circle. And, you know, as Susan's mentioned, this includes things like gender, non-binary gender, subjectivity, multiculturalism, alterity, and dialogism. And but as a consequence of her work and her contribution being backgrounded, lots of those very important debates have also been sidelined. So I just like to finish by, I mean, you don't need me to tell you how important Welby's work is. We've listened to the expert, and that's Susan Petrilli. And I would like to say that there are so many opportunities to build on semioethics, so Augusto Ponzio and Susan Petrilli's work, and also, but I think if you're interested in Welby, you need to look at what Susan's already written. But there's lots more. It's, you know, it's ongoing. It will grow through semiosis. So yeah, that's my final words. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. I just wanted to say, yes, you know, the things are happening, and it's all very exciting. The publications are continuing on Welby, and I've also published chapters in books I've been invited to publish chapters in books on Welby. You and me have a chapter together in that book, Women in Pragmatism, I think it's called, Past, Present and Future. But there are also other initiatives. There's an Oxford handbook, which has not been published yet, with a chapter by myself on Welby. It's an Oxford handbook of women philosophers from the 19th century, for example. And then the British Online Archives commissioned an essay from me, a contextual essay, because what's happening there, the British, I think it's the British Museum, there's a branch, and they're putting all Welby's library, her books, online slowly, but that's happening as well. And that's another important initiative. And then I've also written chapters on Welby for Genevieve Vaughan and her feminist group, particularly interested in her concept of the gift economy, and Welby is certainly in line with that kind of logic as well, you know, the gift logic. So lots of things, yes, happening, and it certainly is worth pursuing her writings, you know, studying, reading her directly. And then, of course, beyond the values that inspire her research and that inspire my own and the people I work with, I think are important to develop and communicate. I mean, you know, if we look at the world today, it is a total mess. And Significs, as semioethics, teaches us to read signs, and we need to read the signs of society. We could even talk of Significs and semioethics as social symptomatology. We need to read signs, interpret signs, and then, of course, according to our value systems, decide how we want to respond, if we want to respond. But certainly the planet is telling us, is calling out to us that it's in trouble. And it's in trouble largely because of this phenomenon of anthropization of the planet. We're responsible. We're all responsible. We need to be doing something about this, not because we're generous, but simply because if we want to survive, we need to respond. We need to act. Pierpaolo Pasolini, an Italian, you probably all know him, poet, essayist, said to Gennariello, a 12-year-old Scugnizzo, boy of the street from Bari, from Naples, sorry. He says in his diary to Gennariello, in this fictional diary, a boy in trouble, a boy from the street, you are responsible. You carry upon your shoulders the responsibility of your fathers. He's saying we all are responsible. We all need to get involved. We've got, you know, this is Welby's lesson as well. I mean, thank God, you know, there are people who work and never stop working for life. You know, why are we here? Why are we studying? Ultimately, not for life of each one of us. And I think, you know, this planetary emergency, human crisis, as I said in my presentation, are telling us that we have to act. And acting is also through the word, is through studying. I think it's important, really important to study, to understand and to transmit all that to our behavior, to human action on a daily basis. They've just killed, executed, destroyed young people for their ideas. I mean, this, for rebelling, this tells us how important it is to continue the work that we're doing for life, for the people, for the community, for the singularity, the unique single individual in his or her otherness. And another thing, important to understand how important otherness is. What unites all these identities here together today? I mean, we're all different. We come from different countries, different cultures, different languages. What unites us? What keeps us together, if not our otherness with respect to the cages of identity? Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Petrilli and Dr. Hurley, Dr. Chapdelaine-Feliciati for this exchange. It was very enlightening and we are lucky to be here, and it was incredible journey throughout Lady Welby's theory. I would like now to announce that we will close the broadcast on YouTube. Thank you, everybody. And but we continue. If Dr. Petrilli have some time for to answer questions.
In answer to you, what I need to let you know is that I'm at the university, at the faculty, and they're going to close the faculty in a few minutes. So I have to leave. And if you want to continue, I need about 15 minutes to get home, and I'll log on when I get back home if you want to continue. Unfortunately, I have to log off now. So I have to say goodbye, and I'm sorry. But at the same time, if you continue, what I'll do is when I get home, I'll check, and if you're still there, I'll join you. Okay, is that all right?
Thank you, Dr. Petrilli, but don't. We wouldn't like to make inconvenience to you.
No.
We are infinitely thankful for your talk. It was incredible lecture, and I think I guess everybody is full of ideas and inspiration. So
let's do this then. I thank you all. I really thank you for listening, and I thank you for the opportunity of being able to share ideas and being together.
I would like just to take 1 second and to announce that we will have tomorrow a lecture by Dr. Jonut Untea, who is also present today here, and we are very much looking forward to hosting it.
Thank you. Absolutely. Okay. All right. So I've got to go, otherwise they'll lock me in here or they'll drag me out. And I will, when I get home, check. If you're there, you're there. If you're not, it's wonderful. This has been wonderful being together. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Ciao. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you all.
Thank you.